move the table and make this more informal, you're welcome to do that too.
Sit on the floor.
But I do want to.
Only you, we're not.
I do want to read your impressive bio though. So we always ask our guest speakers to provide some sort of bio so we know who we are talking with. And you'll get to know the folks in the forum by the questions that they ask.
Perfect.
So be ready. So this is Brennan Schreibman. He is a commissioner at the City of Spokane Human Rights Commission. And the commission advises and makes recommendations to the Spokane City Council on issues related to human rights, unjust discrimination, and the implementation of programs consistent with the needs of all the city's residents. Brennan has worked as general counsel of Eastern Washington University, as an assistant attorney general for the Washington State Attorney General's office, and as a law clerk to Judge Robert E. Lawrence Berry of the Washington State Court of Appeals, and Judge Robert H. Whaley of the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Washington. That's a lot to remember, let alone read.
I don't remember either.
He volunteers as a court-appointed special advocate for abused and neglected children in the foster care system and serves on the board of the Spokane County Bar Association's Young Lawyers Division. How long do you get to be a young lawyer?
They have rules. Not much longer. Not much longer. Yeah.
He received his undergraduate degree in philosophy and economics, so let it never be said that a person with a philosophy degree can't make something of his life. So philosophy and economics from Gonzaga University and his law degree from Villanova University School of Law. And you brought a friend with you, and we should at least say hi and welcome. Do you want to introduce her? Or?
Hi everyone, this is Osti Galina. She helped me put everything together yesterday. By that, I mean she did most of the work.
Excellent introduction.
Does this computer connect to the TV?
Yes, it does. Would you like me to do?
That'd be great. I figured out how to work Prezi for this.
Awesome.
And we'll see how it goes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let me.
It should all be color coded. It would be so much easier.
So do you just need to get online to?
I think so. Yeah.
Okay.
I think it just saves it in there. I don't know. I was
So
learning.
it must be on a drive somewhere.
Yeah. I was learning on the fly.
Okay. Did I miss a step?
No. That's right. Young guy.
You brought them? I'll hand them out.
You know how to say things, it's just say it. Well,
Okay.
we share.
So we can pepper you with questions while you're trying to see if you can multitask while I.
No, let's not, don't distract.
No, I'm just wondering how many people are on the Human Rights Commission?
Right now, there are 8. We have, hopefully the mayor will be appointing our 9th one here in the next couple of weeks, so we'll have a full 9. We have one, so.
Woohoo!
Oh yeah, we're in business. Maybe. We'll see how this goes.
I don't even know what Prezi is.
So, you can be impressed.
Yeah, we were real impressed when we could get our group on Zoom. to figure out how to get everybody's video working. You're on mute, you're still talking on mute.
I had one of those meetings just last week.
So did I.
I'm trying to organize a meeting for 2 years from now for 48 people who are afraid to travel. And I can't imagine they're terrible technical. So I'm supposed to be the, one that's like, yeah, this'll be fun.
We did,
It's a good
we
thing
did
it's 2
memorial
years.
services, we did a memorial service or two on Zoom. And that was very interesting.
I have watched two. My cousin and my cousin's son both died, and there was no way to
Commission
travel.
hasn't opened it, Janet.
Please, yeah.
What are we talking about?
This is a rather informal.
Okay,
All right, so please, it would be great, and I'd be a lot, it'd be great if you just ask questions, make this as informal as possible. Conversation style, that's my favorite way of doing these types of things. So I am a commissioner on the Spokane Human Rights Commission. We are a commission that was established by the city of Spokane in 1981. And our mandate is to advise and make recommendations to city council for, to pass ordinances and implement programs that, serve the needs of residents that kind of sometimes can get forgotten through the normal political process. So it's kind of some examples of things we've done recently. So in, 15, 16, we recommended a city ordinance called Ban the Box. So that was, made it illegal to ask for people if they have convictions, criminal convictions on their record for purposes of employment, if they have, if they have a city business license. The 2017, we created.
So that applied to government jobs, right? Not,
No, that applied to anyone with a city business license.
oh.
Yeah.
Oh.
So private employers as well. 2017, we established Title 18 in the Spokane Municipal Code, which is our law against discrimination, which outlaws, as a city ordinance, it prohibits discrimination on the basis of a number of protected classes if you're doing business in the city. And most recently, we created, and actually City Council just passed the ordinance December 13th, establishing City of Spokane's first Office of Civil Rights. And lots of other cities have offices of civil rights, but we finally got there, and we are in the process of kind of standing it up right now, hiring staff, and figuring out exactly how it's going to work and what it's going to do. So that's kind of what the commission does. We meet every month. We have a variety of committees that kind of keep the work going, and then in I think it was November, then we gave our presentation to City Council, and they ended up passing that ordinance establishing the Civil Rights Office at their December meeting. So that's kind of how it works. So Pastor Cornell asked me to talk about pressing human rights issues in Spokane. And I know that the church is celebrating its 75th anniversary. So kind of it's, I thought it would be good to talk about how human rights and our concept of human rights have evolved over time, and the way we think about them, and the way we address violations of them, kind of how we conceptualize them, and then the tools we use to enforce them. And I thought a good way to go about doing that, which would fit with...
you're welcome to take your mask off. If you
Oh, okay.
not have to deal with that.
Okay.
We'll keep ours on and
Okay. Thank you. I I thought a good way to go about doing that would be to kind of walk through the last 75 years in Washington and with a focus on Spokane of the way that the city and the way that the state of Washington have thought about and supported human rights. So we're going to start with the 1940s. So 40s were, everyone wore hats. Men wore hats. Women wore, we were all wearing hats. We're listening to Bing Crosby's White Christmas. So in 1949, just a couple of years after St. Mark's was established, Washington passed the law against discrimination. It was really cool at the time. I mean, 1949, the Federal Civil Rights Act didn't get passed until '64. So this was a full 15 years before the Federal Civil Rights Act. So Washington was pretty ahead of the curve compared to the federal government. And that's a theme you will see recurring. Washington has been ahead of the curve on, making sure human rights are protected. And it takes the federal government a little bit longer to catch up. It was interesting when Washington, and this is an important point too, is when Washington passed the law against discrimination, the only kind of discrimination that was illegal was on the basis of race, national origin, and color. So that's interesting to think about, right? So like we think about protected classes now, right? Like we think about, yeah, exactly. Like we think about like the panel.
Religion doesn't have that.
So it included creed. Yeah, and that was later interpreted to mean religion. So race, creed, color, national origin. And we think about we think about kind of the panoply of human rights now, and what we think about them. That was very different when we were listening to Bing Crosby and wearing hats all the time, and so those were the only protected classes. What Washington also did at the time was it created a body, an entity to enforce that law. So at the time it was called the Washington State Board Against Discrimination. And that entity still exists, has a different name now, but its purpose was to, it was an enforcement agency. I mean, it took testimony, it could subpoena witnesses, it could command businesses to stop violating, when it found that businesses were violating the law, it could command them to stop. All right, so 1950s. We're listening to Johnny Be Good by Chuck Berry. Elvis was a thing. Everyone was wearing leather jackets. Everyone had their hair greased back. And this was really a time where there was a big case in the Supreme Court called Brown versus Board of Education, and that desegregated public schools, at least legally. But it also had the effect of causing, so legally school districts couldn't separate their schools anymore, but that caused a lot of flight to the suburbs. And so, white communities would move out to the suburbs, and so based on, where their property taxes would fund different schools, and that created still segregated schools, but just not legally so. It just was more of a de facto segregation. At this time, discrimination in hiring practices was a major focus. In 1951, the NAACP, they challenged the Spokane school board's practice that it wouldn't hire black teachers. Superintendent John Shaw refused to employ someone named Eugene Breckenridge, who was a qualified black applicant to be a teacher. And the district hadn't actually employed a black teacher or administrator since 1936. So you're talking about it's not legal discrimination, but it's these, you know, it's the practices of they're doing it anyway, but they're finding different reasons, yeah. But you'll still notice that the focus in the 50s was really on race, you know, so it was a race-focused, that was like what discrimination was, and that's what, you know, human rights were in the 50s. Karl Maxey, you know, the boxer, he did some other stuff too. He was counsel for the NAACP at the time, and he threatened to sue the school district. And as a result, the Spokane School District approved teaching contracts for 6 black teachers, which, I mean, when you haven't had a black teacher since 1936, that's a pretty big deal. There was a lot of other kind of famous instances that kind of put Spokane in the spotlight on the emerging and the burgeoning civil rights movement. Sammy Davis Jr. and Louis Armstrong were both refused service at the Davenport Hotel. Hazel Scott, who was an actress at the time, was refused service on a Greyhound bus from Pasco to Spokane. So she ended up bringing a discrimination lawsuit against the restaurant that refused to serve her on the way to Spokane. And another kind of theme you'll see here is individual enforcement. So we have this kind of narrow concept of human rights. It's really focused on race. The law in Washington only says race. And then we also, the way that people enforce that is really through, you know, somebody who is aggrieved has to go to all the trouble of, or the NAACP, right? All the trouble of filing an individual lawsuit to vindicate the rights of that one person. So there wasn't really a systemic push. I mean, the laws were there, but it really counted on people, individuals, to be like, absolutely not. I'm going to take 3 years out of my life, you know, right? And this is going to consume me because it's the right thing to do. But that's a big ask.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, like, think about Hazel. She was an actress. She had other things to do, you know, rather than sue a restaurant and spend 3 years of her life litigating that. But that's really how this was enforced.
Not to diminish Rosa Parks, but when you look at their different circumstances, you know, it was going to cost her time and money.
Right.
To sue the restaurant and give up the opportunity to perform.
Yeah, well, I mean, same thing with Rosa Parks too. I mean, she had other stuff going on.
Well, and maybe at more risk to her because she had less means.
Right.
Right.
Did Hazel Scott get a settlement?
She sure did.
Good job.
She won her case. This is another question. She already knows the answer. She wrote the thing.
Good prompt.
It's a polite prompt.
Yeah. Softball question. Just check the notes. She brought her lawsuit in federal courthouse in Spokane. That's that big bomb shelter building right there across from the Spokane Review office, where we both work. She was awarded $250 in damages, which is not a ton of money. In the 50s, it obviously was a lot more. But you know, when you think about like the injustice there, I mean, you know, that's not.
Trayvon's Martin killers was acquitted, so,
Right.
you know.
Yeah. 1960s, go-go boots, mini skirts. We were all wearing mini skirts. We were listening to the Beatles.
Still listening to
Still listening to the Beatles. Paul McCartney, come to Spokane.
Yeah, we talked about that before you arrived.
Did you see that? Yeah. I know, that's factored into
So
that.
what year was the suit that she filed?
1949. Well, it happened in 1949. She brought suit a few years later, went on throughout the 50s. 1960s, so another thing that was happening at the time, there was a lot of discrimination in housing. And so, this is another theme that we'll circle back on later, but there were a couple ways that this happened. So the first way was a thing called restrictive covenants that people put into housing deeds, which was basically in the housing deed, you put a clause in there that basically prohibited the conveyance of the property to a certain category of person. In the 1960s, it was black people, that it prohibited conveyance of property to African Americans.
So that's
And it's-
different than redlining, right?
That was different than redlining, yeah. Redlining was a federal, which was,
Yeah.
federal government did it, right? Which was also, that happened as well, yeah, and that was also in the, like, you know, the post-World War II, you know, the giving out, you know, mortgage loans in only in certain areas. And this wasn't a federal government policy, this was a private policy, so individual private people could put, you know, these clauses in their deeds, these racially restrictive covenants that would prohibit the passage of property to, you know, to people that they didn't want to have that property. Yeah.
Well, maybe you're going into it, but isn't that the beginning of zoning laws that are single-family dwelling only, so that same thing, right?
Yeah, and that's I think that's a corollary, you know, you have to have, you want a certain, you have a certain idea of who you want to live in neighborhoods, and kind of like redlining too. I mean, it's when the government is doing it, that's worse.
It's unconstitutional.
Right, and that was the thing with these restrictive covenants, is they were very difficult to deal with, because when the government's doing it, you sue the government, you know, you can stop doing the government, it's unconstitutional. But the Constitution doesn't apply to private parties. I mean, you're an individual homeowner, and you put this in your house, you can't sue under the Constitution for that, because the Constitution doesn't, like, it doesn't prohibit private individuals from doing anything, it only applies to the government. And so that was kind of it was a cynical and it was a sinister way of segregating the city. Another way that the city kind of became segregated was, there was, I apologize if there are any realtors in the audience. The realtors kind of had unspoken, you know, whatever you call them, agreements that they would kind of systematically increase down payments on homes in certain areas, you know, so that to put them out of the price range of people that they didn't want to buy those houses. They would also just refuse to show houses, just flat out refuse to show houses to it, depending on the neighborhood, right? And so then this had the effect of, you know, kind of, you know, quartering, you know, black people into certain, into
So
neighborhoods.
they showed a lot more listings in East Central than they did on the
Yes,
South Hill.
correct. And actually the 1960 census reflected this as well. So the 1960 census showed that black residents of Spokane only had access to 40% of the housing, which, you know,
And then they put the freeway.
yeah, exactly.
You tear it up, you don't have any
Yeah,
housing.
we don't care about
The
that.
new version of the railroad tracks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
totally.
Well, yeah, the I-90 corridor and now the north-south corridor, where do we put that? Always
Right,
in that low-income area.
where people have no power.
So it kind of in response to these developments, so in 1968, the federal government passes Fair Housing Act, which outlaws discrimination in housing. And Washington did that as well. So Washington was, on the state level, they passed a state law that outlawed the use of racially restrictive covenants in housing deeds. Now those restrictive covenants are still in the deeds, right? They're still down there, you know, but they're just not enforceable. So kind of like with any right? Like they're still in the deeds, but they can't be enforced. You know, you go to court and the judge, absolutely not. There's a law that said you can't do this. And so Washington really was really early on, they recognized this as a problem, and then they passed that statute to stop it.
I have a question.
What'd you forget?
What if that language is in my chain of title and I find it really repugnant, and I want to put something in my chain of title that lets people know that I don't agree with that, and the next buyer can't enforce that covenant? Is there a mechanism to do that in Washington?
No.
Yes, there is.
Yes. There is, so what you can do is you statute, you go to court, and like, you go and you attach the deed as an exhibit, and the judge literally crosses it out, and then you refile it. So you can, it wasn't enforceable to begin with, but these things are still harmful. I mean, having these, I mean, imagine living in a house, you know, and you own the house, but there's a racially restrictive covenant. I mean, it's not enforceable, but like, it's in your deed that says like, I'm not allowed to live here. So you can go to court, and you go in there, and you just have, the judge just literally scratches it out, and you refile it.
At what cost to the homeowner
Yeah,
who
well,
wants
of
to
course.
remove that?
It's free.
But it takes time.
It takes time.
Yeah.
It takes time, yes. And
Time off work.
right,
for-
and if you even know it's in there, which we will circle back on later. 1970s, we're listening to September by Earth, Wind, and Fire. We're wearing bell bottoms. I wasn't.
You're not even lying.
Some people thought wearing bell bottoms was a good idea.
They were cool.
Hey Dave, hey Dave,
They're coming
right on.
And you'll notice here that in the 70s, the concept of human rights started to get bigger. So 40s, 50s, 60s, civil rights movement, it was really focused on race. And in the 1970s, kind of society's concept of what human rights were really started to grow. And that's, to touch back on the theme I started off to begin with at the beginning, I mean, the way we think about what human rights are is always an evolving concept. And this, in the 1970s, that was an instance of when it really started to evolve. So the 1970s, huge push for gender equality. You know, it was the feminist movement happened, and Equal Rights Amendment to the United States Constitution was passed through Congress with 2/3 support.
Recently passed by Mississippi.
Yeah.
It still doesn't
no
exist.
effect.
I know.
Right, exactly.
What people that makes a difference on it.
I mean, right, think about something now passing with 2/3. I do. And then it went to the states for ratification. Washington State ratified it almost immediately the next year, March of 1973. And I mean, this is, right, like, again, this is an instance of Washington being ahead of the curve.
Even though women still couldn't go to the country club or the Spokane club, but that's okay.
Correct, correct, yes.
But that didn't bother you at all.
There has been justice at the Spokane Country Club.
It has taken a while.
Yes.
Now who wants to go?
We never wanted to be there in the first place.
Exactly.
Ultimately, the Equal Rights Amendment fell 3 states shy of ratification, even though Washington was right there. Don't get me started on Phyllis Schlafly, but there was a counter movement that happened in response to it.
So, talk about that a little bit. It's amazing the amount of power she was able to wield.
Was she from Washington?
No,
No. Okay.
no. It was a national movement, yeah, and it kind of coincided with the Southern strategy.
It's funny, I really never heard nothing about it, but that's because I wasn't hanging out with that crowd.
So I'm not familiar with that, do you mind just kind of?
He was in grade school or preschool.
Not born yet.
Not
Born yet.
Yeah, a couple of us weren't born yet.
Is it?
Not born yet.
Is it Schlafly or Schlafly?
Schlafly, right?
I know a brewery.
Who cares?
Anyway.
I mean, come on.
It's-
Yeah.
Wherever she was.
There's an F in there.
So-
Schlafly.
The word I
Just
have
the
right before it
haiku of
starts
this
with a
sad
D, but
tale.
I will not.
Oh!
So
Anyway.
Phyllis,
Whatever.
yeah.
But
She organized, so as the Equal Rights Amendment was really gaining steam, she organized a counter movement that really, she characterized the Equal Rights Amendment as actually taking rights away from women, even though it literally said like women shall be treated equally, right? Like, but she kind of sold the idea, great salesman, right? Like she sold the idea as it would rob women of their right to stay home and to be taken care of and to like live a domestic life.
Children, yeah.
Right, exactly. And that picked up a
The traditional family of
Right.
the, you know, the cleavers and whatnot of this world.
White male dominated,
Yeah, yeah.
submission
I
family.
picked the fictional character.
But it got a lot of steam. I mean, and people bought it, and that's what ultimately defeated the Equal Rights Amendment, was that movement by free states.
But that's the evangelical right now. I mean, the battle is
Oh, God,
going on.
I see some of that.
But upside down thinking.
You wonder where people stand.
No, this is good, this is good, this is good. You always like an audience.
Yeah.
You like an audience that's on your side.
It's not, yeah.
Washington State was still at work though. I mean, and then you'll, kind of the expansion of what we think about human rights. So the Washington State Legislature, remember at this point, only race, creed, color, national origin. So the Washington State Legislature in the 70s changed that law. It also included sex. So this is when this Equal Rights Amendment tanked. But Washington State added sex, it added marital status, it added age, and then it added physical and mental disability to the list of protected categories, which, huge thing. I mean, if you think about not just adding those categories of themselves, but just the fact that the reconceptualization of human rights is something more than race. I mean, it's people shouldn't be treated differently because they were born with a physical or mental handicap, right?
I see this playing out so much in this era, in the 70s, as being prohibited from borrowing money to start businesses,
Right.
both among, blacks and among women.
Yeah.
The colleagues of mine could not get loans who had graduated and had everything, any guy had, but they couldn't get loans, so they couldn't start to accumulate wealth and ownership and all of that. Same with blacks. So, I mean, does the law govern financial institutions? Like it said, they can't sell to, they changed the real estate law, but how about access to capital? I mean,
Right.
that's, and how is that happening here, access to capital?
No, that's a fabulous point. And so the Washington Law Against Discrimination, it outlaws discrimination in a number of capacities. And so you can't discriminate in public accommodations, right? So one, employment. You can't refuse to hire someone because of race, or you can't fire them because of race. Public accommodations, you can't, if you're a place of public accommodation, you can't refuse service. There's a special line in there about financial transactions and real estate transactions. But,
I want access to capital.
right,
Yeah,
so
okay.
financial transactions is right there in the statute. But to your point, I mean, and that's a great thing to bring up. Until the 1970s, all of those protections, public accommodations,
Right.
employment, access to capital, only applied to race. And then in the 70s, they changed that, and so you can't deny someone access to capital because of their sex. So that was it. That was a watershed moment.
But like the accountability on that, who's assessing, like what percentage of loans have been given to black, what percentage, so an individual who feels
And
like
who
they've been.
has to defend the black person or the woman?
Right.
It's gonna be a white man.
Right. Exactly. Yes. Exactly.
So, I mean, looking for equity and ensuring equity, I guess that, to my point of your commission, you know, how do you, so an individual doesn't have to take the burden of the class, but we're looking for places that are, you know, not enforcing or not allowing human rights.
Yeah, and actually, that's a great point. So, you know, I talked about 40s, 50s, it really depended on individuals filing individual lawsuits, hiring a lawyer, I don't wanna hang out with them. So the 60s and 70s is really when that board against discrimination that the Washington law created, they really got going.
Okay.
And so that they didn't do much throughout the 50s, but then in the 60s, they did a lot. I mean, cases came in. There was a case, Little Brick Bar refused service to serve a black person. He filed a complaint with the Board Against Discrimination. They took testimony. They held a hearing, and then they ultimately fined the business. They had to post the law, right? Like they made the bar post the law right there. There was another one where a black woman didn't get hired at a grocery store, and the same exact thing. They took her complaint, they investigated, they held a hearing, and then they fined the business, and then awarded her what she would have made in wages.
Okay, so the law had legs.
Well, it was, yes, it did.
And enforcement.
And it was the government that was enforcing it. So
Yeah.
individuals didn't have to do this
Yeah,
stuff. There
that's
was a public body
Right.
that did the legwork for you.
Yeah.
And I think probably the most famous case that came out of this exact board, which is now known as the Washington State Human Rights Commission. So ours is the city. The Board Against Discrimination ultimately was renamed in the 70s to the Washington State Human Rights Commission. The most famous case that came out of this board was Wheeler's Barbershop. John Wheeler had a barbershop in the Peyton Building in downtown Spokane, which is right there across from like the Luso and Greater Spokane Incorporated. And then he had operated for 40 years. There was a 21-year-old Black Gonzaga student from Liberia who was actually he was on a Fulbright scholarship. Okay?
Yep.
He's a smart kid. He goes in and he's refused a haircut. And so in response to this, 35 Gonzaga students start picketing.
Good.
It was a cross-section of the Gonzaga community, white students, black students, student body officers, athletes. They start picketing the barbershop, they shut it down for the day. And the scenes from this picket actually really propelled Spokane and it made national news as a focal point of the civil rights movement. And that ended up going to this board, that case. And
When did that happen again?
that was actually in the 60s. That was 63.
Okay.
But this board is doing stuff.
Okay.
And it ended up going all the way to the Washington State Supreme Court.
So there must have been no black barbers in Spokane at the time. What
Right.
black man would go to an old-time white guy for a haircut?
Well,
Where I have a purple flag here, just that, I don't think that's a fair conversation, that uses stereotypes too.
It's true.
but
According to my black friends, they can't get a good haircut.
but that's the point of these public accommodations laws, like, right? If you're gonna be a business that's open to the public,
Yeah.
you don't get to discriminate.
Right.
Sorry, John Wheeler, like, you know, like, somebody comes in and you can't refuse service based on these protected classes, and that's the reason why
You
we
can
have
give a
this.
bad haircut.
You can give a bad haircut. You're allowed to be a crappy barber, you know?
How about age discrimination, is that a protected class?
70s. Yep, that's
Because
included.
I, you know, obviously ageism is something you experience in the employment, but I'm thinking about young children now who want to get vaccines, but their parents are anti-vaxxers. Or young children who want to get involved in birth control, but they don't have, you know, when does a child have agency in the law? I guess that's part of what I'm.
Yeah, that's a complicated question. Minors, they don't have the same,
Yeah, but minors, isn't that kind of just arbitrary at this point?
Pretty
It's a minor.
yeah.
It's my body.
But it's defined, it's in the
Yeah,
statute.
I'm just questioning where that line has been drawn with
18.
how sophisticated and grown up our
18
children are.
unless you're emancipated,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
Right.
Good, good.
Yeah.
Actually, Washington was just trying to pass a law that allowed children, no age limit, to access healthcare, et cetera, without their parents' consent. And there was a huge uproar, of course,
It's a different kind of slavery if
in
you're
certain-
unenlightened.
in certain categories, but the idea was that if a middle school kid wanted to get vaccinated and their parents didn't want them to, they could still do it legally.
That's human rights, I'm just saying that too is human
Yeah,
rights.
yeah, no, I agree
We
with
have
you.
to become an emancipated
Email the
minor.
I'm getting, I have action points at the end.
Okay, great, okay, I'm sorry.
No, this is good, this is good.
You're ahead of the curve, Janet.
1980s, big hair, Prince. Women had big hair, men had big hair, everybody had big hair. And you'll notice, this is another example. So 70s, age, sex, physical and mental disability, marital status, can't discriminate against those. There's big, our concept of human rights continued to expand. James Chase was elected as our first black mayor. And there was an increased focus on people who were suffering from HIV and AIDS. So in the 80s, having AIDS or HIV also became a protected class in employment. So what employers would do is they would make people take tests before they offered them employment, and or while they were employed. And so what Washington, way ahead of the federal government, right? Like cutting edge on this. Washington's like, no, you can't test people, you can't discriminate against people's AIDS or HIV status in employment unless it pertains to like a bona fide occupational qualification. Like there are exceptions, but generally you can't discriminate on that. And you also start to see with this kind of expanding notion of what human rights are, you start to see not just private enforcement, not just government enforcement, but there are also kind of grassroots movements that get together that are really buying into this idea of human rights that are expanding. So Spokane AIDS Network was established as a network for medical caregivers and concerned citizens to coordinate for people who were living with HIV and AIDS. Disability Rights of Washington was founded, which disability just became a protected class the previous decade, and so they advocated for for the protection and of people who were in treatment facilities or who were otherwise had protection under the statute but didn't have the means to advocate for themselves. 90s. Everyone's wearing denim. Everyone's wearing flannel. And 90s, this is really this is where I started. But it was eclectic. It was an eclectic decade. I mean, we had grunge, we had Jay-Z, but also the song Barbie Girl was a thing. right? Like, it's, what? Why? But it was an eclectic decade. And the way the concept of human rights actually kind of reflected that too. So we're seeing a lot more concern about, we're finding other ways that people become marginalized other than, we're these grassroots organizations, the government bodies are finding other ways that people are marginalized. Spokane established the Regional Domestic Violence Coalition in the 1990s. And then the Washington law against discrimination added the use of service animals as a protected right too. So we're kind of getting into the weeds and finding where people are being pushed out of society in kind of unique ways, ways that otherwise might have flown under the radar. Spokane Pride started the Pride Parade, and Chaz opened its first clinic in the 90s, providing healthcare for people who didn't have insurance, and their big thing was regardless of your ability to pay. And so that, I mean, they talk about human rights, healthcare, I mean, that's about as basic as it gets. But that wasn't really in the mind of the government, the people. That wasn't in people's minds, you know, up until that point. Which, but you start to see how these things evolve. 2000s, Shrek, Smash Mouth.
I found out why Smash Mouth is actually called that, because they were the lead-in band for U2 at a concert I went to, and they smashed the microphone into their mouth so you cannot understand any of the words. Walking on the moon.
Yeah. I like Smash Mouth. Shrek soundtrack, I will just say it right now, best movie soundtrack of all time. I'm just saying, I'm in with the better one. Washington still making movement, and it's really adding nuance to the ways that it protects people. So the HIV protection that was added in the 80s, they also added hepatitis C as a protected class in the 2000s. 2006, the Washington legislature expressly added sexual orientation to the law against discrimination. Now, the federal Civil Rights Act, the feds never did that. And this is another example of Washington being ahead of the curve when it comes to how the state thinks about and addresses human rights.
But you said 2006.
2006.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Just let that sink in a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah.
I would kind of argue that sexual orientation also kind of falls under familial status under the federal.
Yeah, that's actually a great point. So, federal Civil Rights Act it just says sex. So it never said sexual orientation. And actually that question, whether the Federal Civil Rights Act protects sexual orientation, that question didn't get resolved until 2020. And the Supreme Court actually decided that sex includes sexual orientation. But 2020, I mean, Washington did this back in 2006, you know?
So, when was it that we got rid of Mayor West because people were upset that he was gay?
2005?
Yeah.
I think that sounds right to me.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. But yeah, exactly. I mean, that was a
It may have been more because he was a liar than he was.
Oh, yeah. I also want to mention that I think it's important to remember what was going on in 2005. There was, we're kind of in the middle of the Bush years, and he really ran on re-election a lot on anti-LGBT issues. So it was a lot more in the forefront of people's minds at that time.
Yeah, totally.
But in 2008.
Yeah.
Things also change, yes.
In addition to hepatitis C, sexual orientation, Washington added veterans and military status as a protected class. In 2009, they added the right of people to breastfeed in places of public
Oh,
accommodation.
good Lord.
So, 2009.
Is there a statue?
Yep.
Good Lord.
Yeah, but I mean, these
They've only
are
been doing that for like thousands of years.
right.
But
these are
just
things-
go in the bathroom.
These would have never been in this never would have been in the minds of 40 years ago, but in the 2000s, I like the number.
Yeah.
But yeah, veterans, breastfeeding, hepatitis C, sexual orientation. And in 2020, Washington added citizenship and immigration status to the statute as well. So, I mean, we've got a broad definition
Yeah.
now. It is really expansive, which never, I mean, it wouldn't have been in the minds of people.
I guess you're painting a really good story, though. I made progress.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right, and I mean, there has been progress made. there's still more to be done. And so, kind of coming to today, two issues that the Spokane Human Rights Commission are really focused on now are, one is access to housing. I mean, think about what we talked about the 60s, you know, the how everything was racially segregated. It's evolved. The problem has evolved, but it hasn't been solved. And so, you know, we're looking at things like, you know, having toilets and hand washing stations at the warming center. I mean, basic.
Having a warming center.
Having a warming center, yeah, exactly. And we added access to housing as to our 2022 work plan. So that's an issue we've really been looking at. Race is another one, which is, you know, in that, you know, comes out in multiple ways. We've been looking at police. You know, police brutality. We have a lot of commissioners who that's really their main focus. Spokane, they do what was the name of the organization? Mapping Police Violence in coordination with Stanford University. They do this study of the deadliest police departments in the country, per capita, so based on population, and Spokane's third, behind St. Louis and Oklahoma City. So that's
And proud of it, probably.
well,
I don't know.
I don't know.
Why is it for
yeah, I don't know, but it's an issue. I know Chief Meidel it's front of his mind.
Yeah.
He is committed,
Sure.
And so that I don't know
Spokane
about.
County.
Yeah, I was gonna say,
Yeah.
county and city is
Across
different.
the city line, yeah.
I think.
How-
Chief Meidel, though.
We can talk the same or we can not say.
He's a good one. He makes a concerted effort to educate himself. And I've gone to community events where he'll sit down
Thank
and
you.
just take it. I mean,
That's great.
it's incredible. I mean,
That's
he puts in the work.
So can I ask what is potentially a hot button issue? Who, does the Human Rights Commission pay attention to prosecutorial records in the county?
We talked about that at our last meeting.
Actually, the Spokane County Bar Association does, and we heard a presentation a few months ago at Rotary that clearly identified the racial inequalities in arrests and charges and prosecution and sentencing, which Ozzy objected to, so we had to listen to Ozzy too. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, can I ask a question related to what Dave just said?
Yeah.
I know it's county, not city, but I read with dismay, and I don't know the lowdown, but Maggie Yates working for the county and I don't remember her exact title, but to work on justice and equity within the system and to reform the system. And she resigned, it sounds like, because the county was going to create a boss above her to keep her in check, which sounds exactly like what they did to Bob Lutz in the health district. We don't like what you're doing, so we're gonna hire someone over you to put a leash on you.
Yeah.
What happens to all of that now?
So
That's what
steps. My last point, or so Pastor Cornell asked me to talk about steps, and I have a few. So the city of Spokane, we have a complaint form. It's on our website in Title 18, and so if someone instances of discrimination, go to our website, fill out the complaint form. And the Office of Civil Rights that just was created in December, and we're currently in the process of staffing. They investigate and then they coordinate with the city attorney's office to handle it as necessary. So go to the Spokane Human Rights Commission's website, there's a complaint form there. Fill that out. Contact the Office of Civil Rights. Jarrell Haynes is currently in charge of it. We're in the process of hiring a director for that office, and they will
He
be.
is outstanding.
I know, I work with him a lot. Yeah, he's fabulous. Send us your ideas. So if you have ideas for city ordinances, bandbox, Office of Civil Rights, Title 18, send them to me. We'll talk about them. We'll flag them for city council. Like, that's what we're here for.
Right.
So shoot me an email, complaint form, and then last couple things is there's volunteering. So 2021, the Washington State Legislature passed a law that actually requires Eastern Washington University to go through all the deeds in the 20 counties in Eastern Washington, identify racially restrictive covenants,
Wow,
and notify the homeowners.
wow.
Who knows what's in their deed, right? Like, how often do you read that? If I want to go to sleep. But Eastern Washington is involved in that project. And they let Professor Cibula over at Eastern is coordinating it. So see how you can get involved there. You can always refer people to the, I'm plugging the County Bar Association here, but we have a volunteer lawyers program. We have a housing justice project. We have an eviction clinic. We have a family law clinic that covers domestic violence issues. And then the VLP also takes civil cases for low-income people as well. So I have the coordinator's contact information if anyone wants it. If you want to do that, my cards are right here. Feel free to shoot me an email. Go to our website, the City of Spokane Human Rights Commission. Follow us on Facebook. And so I think kind
You
of.
don't have a YouTube channel too, do you?
No.
Instagram.
Yeah. No, we're working on hiring an intern.
I'm wondering
We're working on it.
how do people who most need to let you know what's going on, how do they know you exist? Are you doing community outreach of some kind so people know?
That's why I'm here.
I know, but,
Yeah.
yeah, we can spread it, but, I'm
No,
just
I know.
also wondering on the ground level, or is it, how is this being communicated? In addition to us.
I'm chair of the outreach committee, and so as of last month.
Okay.
And so that's my job is
Okay.
to try and figure out, if you have ideas, good Lord, let me know.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
perfect, okay,
Right, so
okay.
kind of what I've been doing are things like
This
this.
was fabulous.
Yeah.
This was totally eye-opening.
Yeah, I know you have a service, but thank you all so much. If you have ideas, cards are right here, let me know. It was great to meet all of you.
And thank you for keeping them on the street.
He was, did he ask you or did you tell him I need to come along?
Exactly.
So.
You're always welcome here.
We have